Thank you so much. Hello and welcome everyone to aMS Southeast Asia 2021. I hope everyone's having a great conference with this amazing lineup of sessions and speakers that we've got. Again, we thank all our sponsors mentioned in this slide deck for backing the event. And there are also a couple of prizes to be won towards the end of the conference where you are asked questions, you need to submit the answers. All the answers are present, or you will find answers to all the questions that are present in all the speaker sessions that are there. I have given my questions as well, and you will find answers to those after I complete my session. Yeah. So, what I'll be talking about today is staying compliant with retention and records management in Microsoft 365 or mainly in SharePoint Online is what is the focus for today. A little about me before we start today's session. I'm Kunal Kankariya and I am from Chennai, India. I'm a Microsoft 365 solutions architect at Infotection with a focus on information governance and protection in Microsoft 365. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. Been about 2 straight years now. I do provide training on two courses, especially on Microsoft 365 retention records management, and the other one is Microsoft 365 information privacy and protection. Right. My career started with SPS 2003, all the way to Microsoft 365 now. It's been a long journey. Throughout my career, I have helped numerous Fortune 500 organizations with their digital transformation journey in Microsoft 365. Yes. Okay, let's get started. Why retention and records management first? Why do we even need to do this? Now, one of I like to share this quote from the CEO of my organization, Atle, who says, "When companies buy software as a service, the only lasting asset is the information. Right? That's the asset that a software creates. Information. Effective customer management, customer engagement, business operations, compliance all rely on one single thing: effective information management or effective information governance. Now, what are some of the benefits to consider? First, it provides an organization to establish a foundation for digital transformation, right? When you're doing a retention records management project in any organization, more often than not, what you will actually see is that you're actually not only concentrating on retention and records management. I've been in multiple engagements where I've done this. The focus is highly on information governance, because what will happen is when you get to know this is the focus is on information architecture. And when you have a solid information architecture, you lay the foundation for digital transformation in Microsoft 365. For example, you will provide users with, let's say, master data, or as metadata for their unstructured information, and that enables you to connect information across the organization. It will be easier to then start any business transformation initiatives on as because you've laid the foundation, right? So that's the first important reason why organizations get started with such a project. The second thing is to improve search. Of course, if you have a good information architecture in place, there will be better access to information, which will reduce the time knowledge workers have to spend looking for information, right? So better information governance means knowledge workers can trust the information they find. They know it is the right file, it is the right version. Trust in the system is very important, so that you have adoption, right? Many people struggle. I have problems with adoption in my organization, adoption of Microsoft 365, and these are the things that you need to do to gain the trust of the users in the organization. The third one is to ensure regulatory compliance. There are a myriad of regulations that require an organization to keep information for a minimum set of years. Privacy regulations that require some information to be deleted. Let's say, for example, when a customer or a staff leaves an organization, to meet the principles of data minimization and storage limitation, both of which are a part of GDPR, like storing information forever in Microsoft 365 is therefore not compliant with GDPR and similar privacy regulations. And different countries have different laws, different regulations on how to govern information. Better information governance with all these information governance features will ensure you to meet legal requirements for both minimum and maximum retention. All right. So most of the times the regulations state that information should be deleted after a few years of its shelf life, and should also be retained for a longer period in some cases. So each country, as I said, has different laws, different regulations, and organizations need to comply with those laws. So it helps you ensure meet these regulatory compliances, right? And then you have reduce e-discovery costs. A research a couple of years ago found out that about 68% of the information kept by organizations is rot, redundant, trivial, and outdated. Right? Better information governance allows you to automate the deletion of rot, which will significantly reduce your e-discovery costs. Right? So if you have less information to comb through, the e-discovery cost is significantly less. Minimize risk. It could take years and years to establish a company's reputation as a solid brand, right? But just 10 minutes to destroy the reputation if the sensitive information is lost or is misplaced, or is shared outside the organization. Um, it is therefore imperative that organizations implement retention and disposition to meet or minimize these risks, because then you have only limited. Hello, I'm sorry. Okay, I thought that was a question. Fine. So it is therefore important to make sure that all the information that is not of value, that is not required to be retained, is not present in the organization in order to minimize those risks. And of course, improve information security. As I said, the foundation for retention and records management will be the information architecture, which also gives you an incentive to make sure that information is protected and accessible. All right. So usually protection is, when we talk about information protection, people think that we will be trying and blocking people from accessing information, but that's not the case. You require your knowledge workers to collaborate with both people inside and or outside the organization, but you at least need to make sure that you have all the auditing capabilities in place. You have some protection capabilities in place that allow you to monitor the activities that the users are doing as an admin, and also to make sure that sensitive information is protected wherever it may go, right? Or you can stop the sensitive information from leaving your organization. Now, that's about retention and records management, and um, the benefits of doing retention and records management. Now, why retention and records management in Microsoft 365? There are a lot of tools out there, but why are we specifically talking about Microsoft 365? Now, based again on my experience of working with customers, the one important and major reason is that the sheer number of options that are available to configure retention and records management, and we are going to see some of these in today's session, but I think that's one of the best reasons to make sure you do retention and records management in Microsoft 365. Gone are the days when you used to have a centralized repository only to do records management system, or a specialized software only to do records management outside, because now with Microsoft 365, retention and records management can be done in place where the information lives, where active collaboration happens, and as I said, in place within the Microsoft 365 tenant. Okay, so quickly, retention labels. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is retention labels. A retention label is just like a tag or a metadata applied to a document or an email, so that it gets certain retention settings. Now, the setting it gets depends on the type of the or the configuration of the label. The label might just be a retention label, in which case only retention settings are applied to that particular item or that particular document on which the label is applied. The label can also be a record label. Along with retention, the item is also declared as a record. What that means is when the item is a record, no one can edit the file, no one can delete the file. When I say no one, it's mainly the end users. Of course, the admins have the ability to remove the label and change the label if they want to. But then record label, most of the times end users will not be able to change or replace or even edit the file or delete the file. Then there is a regulatory record label, which when applied to documents, apply further restrictions. For example, in this case, you can't even edit the metadata. Now, the important thing is that regulatory record label is a new feature. It was not there earlier. And what regulatory record label, one thing to remember is that once a regulatory record label is applied to a document, not even Microsoft or not even the admins can remove that particular label on that document, right? So you have to be very careful when you use regulatory record labels. They are meant for highly regulated companies to meet some specific compliance laws like FINRA and others, right? So these are the three kinds of labels that are present. One thing to note is that records management in Microsoft 365 is driven only through retention labels. Now, a retention label has three different components. What I'll do is let me show you in the Compliance Center how to create a retention label, right? I'm not going to create, but I'm just going to walk you through the wizard and I'll explain as and when we go through that wizard. So let me just quickly. So here I'm in the Compliance Center, and when you navigate to the Compliance Center and you've been given the records management role, or you are the compliance admin, or any kind of access that gives you, or any kind of permissions that give you access to the records management, then you will be able to navigate to records management in the Compliance Center and click on file plan. Here is where you have the option to create the label. Okay. Right. So I'm going to click on create a label. The first thing that you're asked, of course, is to name your label, provide a description for the users, provide a description for the admins. Again, a naming convention is specific to an organization, but what I would recommend is to make sure that retention labels have a user-friendly name, because if you're going to manually publish them, it should be easier for the users to understand what a retention label means. For example, I'm just going to use an example, legal information. All right, that's the name of my label. Again, in a production setting, you would give it an appropriate description for your users to understand and a description for the admins to understand. Since it's a demo, I'm going to skip this and I'm going to go next. The next one is file plan. A file plan provides description or context to your labels, whether it is a business or legal or an organizational requirement for you to have this label in place. Most of the organizations do have a retention schedule, and as a part of that, they do maintain why a particular retention schedule is required, whether it's for business reasons or is it required because of a compliance or a regulatory law that I need to have this label in place. Which particular department or function in my organization will this label be applied to or belong to, in a sense? So all those metadata of a label can be captured here in this particular scene, right? Now this in no way affects the settings, retention settings, but this is just for you when you have a lot of labels in place and when you export the information out. And if you forget why I had created the label in the first place, this would help you, right? If filling these details will help you understand why this label was created. And even for new admins, when they join the organization, the old ones leave, they know exactly why this label was created in the first place. So very good practice to have this information in place. I'm going to skip this. It's not mandatory for the demo, just in the interest of time. We'll go next. Now, the first, as I said, the first one was file plan. The next one is the label defines some controls and actions, right? Controls determine what should be applied during the retention period on that particular file. Things like how long it should be kept for, what's the trigger on which you should calculate the disposition date, specific or when to start the retention on that particular information. Should users be able to edit the file or should the file be locked? Is there a regulatory records case to support these regulatory cases, which we have already talked about, right? So what should happen during the retention period and what will be the trigger of the retention is what the controls is all about, which is the first option. what do you want to do when this particular label is applied to a document or an item in Microsoft 365. So do you want to retain the items for a specific period? If yes, what is the period? You can have a custom period that can go on from years, months to days, right? And then you specify when the retention starts, based on what? When items were created, when items were last modified, and when items were labeled. Now, these are three age-based or date-based retention periods. Now, the retention will start according to the condition that you've selected. There is an other type of event called as or other type of trigger called as event. Now, and those labels are called as event based labels. When you configure retention labels, you can base a retention period, or you can start the retention of a particular item when a specific type of event occurs. That event triggers the start of the retention period, and all the content with the retention label applied for that type of event get the labels retention enforced on them. Like for example, employees leaving the organization, right? Suppose the requirement is that the employee records must be retained for 10 years from the time an employee leaves the organization, and after 10 years elapse, all the documents related to their hiring, performance, their termination of the employee must be disposed. Right. This is the event that triggers the 10-year retention period, which is employee leaving the organization. Right. So you can create event-based labels as well, apart from the age-based options that you have. Right. So in this case, I'm going to, and then you also have the options to retain items forever. That will make sure the item that no one can ever get rid of that particular document, or it will always be present, right? So retain items forever does that permanent retention, and only delete items when they reach a certain age. What this means is I'm not bothered about retention of a document. I don't care, but I want to make sure that the document is gone maybe after 5 years. After 5 years, it was last modified. That document should be deleted, right? This particular setting takes care of that. And then, of course, there is the last option which says don't retain or delete items. It applies no retention setting. It's just a classification mechanism. But I would advise not to use retention labels as a classification mechanism. Use metadata because that's more relevant. Provides you with more opportunities to better manage your information through metadata. Right. So in this case, I'm going to choose, let's say retention period is going to be 7 years, or let's change it to 10 years. We start the retention period based on when items were labeled, for example, right? And then comes a set of actions, or what should happen during the retention period. Now, with there are two options here: retain items even if users delete. What this means is it will be a standard retention label, right? It does not mark the file as a record. The second option that you have is mark items as a record. The moment you do this, and when the label is applied to a document, that document becomes locked and no one can edit. As I said, the end users cannot edit or delete that particular document or remove the label. So that's records management features. Now, as I said, the only way to drive records management in Microsoft 365 or in SharePoint is to use retention labels, right? So these are the two options that are present during the retention period. And what happens at the end of the retention period? Now, the retention is over. What do I do with the document? Either you choose to automatically delete the document after the retention period. That's the first option. The second option is to trigger a disposition review. Now, the moment you select this, what will happen is in the next page, you will be asked to select who will be the reviewers. That means those reviewers will receive an email that, okay, this particular document's life cycle is going to end, or the retention period is going to end. Please have a look at the document, and you will have three options then for the reviewers: either to permanently get rid of it, or to extend the retention period to a certain date or a specific date, or to relabel the item so that it gets new retention settings. Three options for the reviewers, and Microsoft has recently released a very new feature, which is called multi-stage disposition review. What that allows you to do is it makes sure that the retention flows in sequence. That is, sorry, the deletion or the disposition of the document flows in a sequence it's just like sequential approval, right? So unless the last person in the stage approves it, the document will not be deleted. Uh, and I will show you that. So here I've selected mark items as a record, for example, and trigger a disposition review. I'll click on next. And here add disposition reviews. And now, as I said, Microsoft has recently released this multi-stage disposition review where you can add stages and which are sequential, and reviewers need to complete this in order. So when the first reviewers at the first stage decide that the document should be deleted, it goes to the second stage for an approval, right? Similarly, it will follow up to 5 stages. You can have different people reviewing the document before it gets disposed. So let's say the first stage is the HR stage, right? And it needs to go to the HR first, maybe, right? So then you are required to specify reviewers. You can either assign email-enabled security groups or individual users. In this case, let me select Miriam. Okay, and the next stage I can add as maybe legal. Right. And here I can have another user, Alex. So then it would first go to Miriam for disposition. If Miriam approves that the document should be deleted, it goes to Alex. And when Alex says, yes, the document should be deleted, only then the document gets permanently deleted, right? So all reviewers in all the states need to approve this. And then you review the summary and then create the label. So this is about retention labels, and the next one is let me quickly move next, which is retention label policies. Now we have created the label. You've seen we have created the label. However, it's not immediately available for the users to use that particular label. What you need is a retention label policy that backs that particular label, so that when you publish retention labels, they are included in that retention label policy, which then makes them available for admins and for users to apply to the content, right? So when you create a policy, only then you actually activate the label, and the status of that particular label turns into active. Now, retention label policies specify the locations to publish these retention labels. Now, the same location can be included in multiple retention label policies. What are the options that you have? You can choose to publish these retention labels to locations like Exchange mailboxes, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, Microsoft 365 groups. You can choose, you can include or exclude specific mailboxes, specific SharePoint sites if you want to. You could even include, as I said, and even exclude. Again, a single retention label can be included in multiple retention label policies, right? What are the strategies for applying these labels? Now, there are two ways to apply labels to policies. One is to manually publish the labels, and the other one is to auto apply label policies. Now, when you as I said, there are two options. The label policies determine how the labels will be deployed, whether they need to be manually picked up by users to apply, or should be auto applied based on certain conditions, like when information is tagged with specific metadata, for example, only then apply that label. In the background, Microsoft does all the hard work, heavy lifting to make sure the label gets applied. Now, increasingly, I have seen organizations going towards automated applications of labels, because it is very difficult to rely on the end users to apply retention labels. First thing is to apply retention label and to apply the right retention label. Most of the times what we've seen is end users are not really, they just want to go with their job, right? Their job is to curate information. Their job is to make sure that the information is there in the right workspace, or the right site, or the team. They upload the information. Probably they will tag it with a bit of metadata. Even they don't do that, is what organizations tell me. And that is why manual application of retention labels is relying more on end users to do the right thing, which organizations say that does not happen. And I've seen that people don't do it. So We have seen organization moving towards automated application of retention labels based on certain conditions, and we will talk about that in the next slide when I talk about auto classification. Now, um, okay, so let me quickly show you what a manual label policy would look like. So here the retention label is created, and then you have the option to publish the label or to auto apply. Now, publish the label is the manual option that I was talking about. So we will click on done, and then as you see the title, it says publish label so users can apply them to their content. We've created the label. Now we are going to deploy the label in a sense. Yeah. So there is one question. What Microsoft 365 licenses do we need for records management? Do we need E-type licenses? Yes. Specifically for Microsoft 365 records management, the cheapest option that you can probably get is E3 plus the information governance add-on. You have that option. The other is E3 plus the compliance add-on, and then of course the E5, right? So you can have either of the three in the order of their cost. These three licenses are required for records management. Yeah. So the label is selected. I click on next. Here I can click on locations and I can choose specific locations that I want. Either the Exchange email boxes, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, Microsoft 365 groups. I have the options to include specific sites. Let's say I want to deploy the legal label only to legal sites. I can do that. I can only select the legal sites of my organization and I can deploy that. I can pick and choose. I can switch on, switch off the locations that I don't like or don't want this particular label to be applied to. I can exclude specific sites as well. Right. So that's about deploying the labels. You name your policy description and then you just create the policy. That's it. Right. So that's the step. Now that's about manually publishing. Let's talk a bit about auto classification. So one of the most powerful features of retention labels is the ability to apply them automatically to content that matches specified conditions. In this case, people in your organization don't need to apply the retention labels. Microsoft 365 does the work for them. Auto applying retention labels are powerful because users no longer need to know about any data governance policies that your organization might have. They can just focus on their work. Most of the times, retention is not their priority, right? With this auto classification, you can apply retention labels to content automatically when the content contains sensitive information, for example, or if there are any keywords or phrases that you want to use based on which you want to apply a specific label, or any metadata properties, right? Let's say if the document, if a document has two columns, for example, information type and information status, and I want to make sure that based on these two columns, if the information type is legal and if the information status is final, only then apply a legal information label on that document. You can do that as well. The third one is trainable classifiers. So let's start with sensitive information types first. Now, as I said, you can apply in retention labels to information that might contain some certain sensitive information. Microsoft automatically detects those sensitive informations for you using sensitive information types. Now, sensitive information types are pattern-based classifiers. What do I mean by pattern-based classifiers is that each of these sensitive information types is detected using a combination of formats, keywords, internal functions, regular expressions. Now, Microsoft has about 200 odd sensitive information types that are already created for you in the system. Things like credit card numbers, things like, let's say if I belong to India, India Aadhaar number, India PAN number. If you belong to the UK, you will have the UK driving license number, SWIFT code, bank account numbers, these different types of passport numbers. Specific to most of the countries, there are sensitive information, built-in sensitive information types already provisioned by Microsoft. You can also, of course, build your own custom sensitive information types as well, which works on patterns, as I said. And if Microsoft detects that any particular document contains the sensitive information type that you have selected when you are trying to auto classify, they will apply a retention label on that particular file automatically. So that's your first option of auto apply. The second one is based on keywords and phrases. If the document contains any specific keywords or phrases, it will apply the retention label. The next one is metadata properties. If it has specific metadata attached, then you can apply the retention label automatically. Now, again, the admins would know that for these metadata, to use these metadata properties, you will have to configure an additional step, which is map the crawl properties to managed properties and use the managed properties in your queries, right? So the way the metadata properties work is by using KQL queries, through which you can define the logical conditions based on which the retention label should be applied. The third one is trainable classifiers. Now, this classification method is particularly well suited to content that isn't easily identified either by the manual approach or by the automated pattern matching method like the sensitive information type. Now, this method of classification is more about training a classifier to identify an item based on what the item is and not by what elements that particular item contains, right? So this is more of a machine learning or a machine training kind of scenario where the document is automatically identified based on what the whole document is, right? The whole document is all about the classifier. For example, some of the scenarios where you can use this is, let's say you have contractual documents or contractual agreements in the organization. Most of the times, let's say they are vendor contracts. Most of the times what would happen is they would follow a kind of similar format, maybe a paragraph here or there that changes based on the vendor. Some additional conditions are added, and some additional information is added based on what kind of agreement you're getting in with the vendor. But the format more or less remains the same. That's why trainable classifiers can learn to identify such documents and automatically apply retention labels. So what you do is you go into the system, you create a model, you create a machine learning model by training the classifier, by giving it samples of the document, right? It then learns from those samples and then learns to identify such documents. That's about trainable classifiers. So the three key ways by which you can auto classify information. Now, when we talk about auto classification, the important thing to note here is that it is not easy just to go and turn it on, right? I mean, of course, it is possible to do that, but should you do that is the question. I would recommend no, because your automation heavily depends on your information architecture. Now, if you have a solid information architecture in place, then I think it makes a good case for automation, right? Architecture is the foundation for automation. If you have maybe your metadata is in place, for example, for all the documents within the organization, you have a standard content type, an enterprise level content type that applies to documents. In that case, you can drive automation decisions of these retention labels and these record labels based on these metadata properties, for example, right? So as I said, most of the times the end goal is to improve the information architecture and then drive retention records management through that information architecture. That also means organizations will need robust provisioning solutions, because if you are going to standardize your SharePoint sites, for example, with the standard information architecture, that means it should be available right from the go before you hand over sites to the end users. So if you have self-service site creation enabled, then you might lose that opportunity to do or to apply information architecture on SharePoint site retrospectively. So it is best to have a provisioning mechanism in place that takes care of these things as well. So let's quickly see what auto classification options we have. So here, as I said, we have published the labels, and if I go to label policies, I can also auto apply a label. Again, I'm not going to create a policy, but just to walk you through the wizard here. So when you auto apply a policy, you are asked the same question again, name the policy. Let's say I'm going to call it legal policy. right? And in a production setting, again, give it a good description, not mandatory. So I'm going to skip it. As I said, there are three options. Apply the label to content that contains sensitive information. Apply label to content that contains specific words, phrases, or properties. Apply label to content that matches trainable classifier. When I select the first option and I go next, I have specific templates based on different industries like privacy regulations, maybe GDPR. That's the data that I want to protect. If I select GDPR, it says that it will help detect the presence of PII information, like EU debit card numbers, EU driving license numbers, EU passport numbers, and stuff like that. You have financial information as well. For example, if I want to protect the Australia financial data, I can do that as well. Or if I want to apply retention on financial data, I can do that as well. I can also create my custom sensitive information types, or I can create a combination of custom sensitive information types. Maybe it's not just Australia, but also the UK. I can do that as well by creating custom policies. Now, let me go back and select apply label to content that contains specific words or phrases. Here is where the box to enter your KQL query appears. You can either choose words or phrases, or you can choose your properties. Maybe something like information status is legal. Oh, sorry, information status is final. That's the metadata column that you're using, and maybe information type is legal, right? So I can use a combination KQL queries. If you work with search, you should be familiar, but there is a good documentation out there on this type as well. Okay, so information status, and but what would happen more often than not is that you will not be able to use the direct column names. As I said, IT will have to map these column names to refinable strings so that managed properties are created out of it, and you can use those managed properties instead. The third one is apply label based on content that matches a trainable classifier. Microsoft has some inbuilt trainable classifiers already to identify certain kind of information like source code, harassment, profanity, any document that might contain some kind of threat, profanity, offensive language. You can use that. Any document that resembles a resume, you can use that, for example. Now, these are the built-in ones by Microsoft. There are others that, or the custom trainable classifiers that you can also create. Again, trainable classifier. The whole auto apply is an E5 feature, right? Or E5. When I say E5, please understand that it's E3 plus the information governance add-on, or E3 plus the compliance add-on, or the E5 license, right? So not just the E3. So that's about auto apply a label and auto classification. Let me move next on advanced records versioning. Now, okay, we just covered. So advanced record versioning. Now, another very nifty feature of records management in Microsoft 365 is advanced record versioning. We all know how versioning works in SharePoint, right? Multiple edits to the file creates versions of that particular document if versioning is enabled on the library. Now, there was a requirement by which goes like this, that let's say there is a document, it is a record. Now, most of the times, let's say for an example, it's a HR policy. Now, HR policies are generally records, and let's say the first version of the policy was created. It is a record. That means no one can edit the file, no one can delete the file as long as it is a record. There was a requirement that the HR policy maybe undergoes changes every 3 years or 4 years, and of course there are edits to it. The HR policy changes. Now, what would you have to do before this particular feature was present earlier is to create a copy of that particular document, because you cannot edit the actual document. You had to create a copy of the document, and you had to make edits to that particular document and then upload it again, right? So you ended up having multiple versions of the same document because you couldn't edit the first one. It was a record, right? The record management says that that particular document cannot be edited. Now, in this case, what the problem with that was that, let's say if the end user searches for a HR policy, he will probably get all the three versions because all the three are different files. Now, in that process, what is the final version? We don't know. right? The user does not know which is the final version of that particular document. Um, so Microsoft has introduced a feature by which you can create versions of the records, right? So you have the ability to unlock a record and then edit the same file. I remember when I said that when a record label is applied, you cannot edit the document, but then there is an option also. People with contribute access to that particular document can unlock the document, create a version of it, right? Let's say I'm creating the version 2 of the policy. I modify the document to fit my requirements, and then I lock the record again. So I can lock and unlock how many ever times I want. And what would happen in the background is that versioning would work. Now, people would ask me what would happen because you are now violating the principles of records management because records are supposed to be immutable. What happens in this case is that each previous version of the record or the history of the record is still maintained as a separate file in itself, right? And that ability is to make sure that you still have the integrity, the record integrity intact. Each version, each record version of that file will have its own retention period, right? Will have its own retention period based, let's say, it is based on um, when the document was created. That means each version will have its own retention based on when that particular version was created or when that version was generated, right? So it maintains the integrity of the previous records. It's a single source of truth because now when end users search for that document, they always get the final version, right? They only have to worry about a single document. They don't see multiple copies of that document, and that's advanced records versioning for you. So let's have a quick look at retention labels, what they look like when they're deployed manually for users to be picked up. So for example, let's say in this particular site, SharePoint site, I have deployed some labels or I've manually published some labels. And um, let's say I'm going to create a new document. And I'll close it. Let me just refresh it quickly. So this new document just got created. Now it has already got a non-record label because I've made this particular label as the default for this particular library. But let's say what would happen is, let's say there was no default label. If I select the document and I click on the details pane, when I scroll down, it is just like another metadata, right? So here I get an option to choose the label. I have maybe 10 labels deployed, and then the end users can choose the label that they want, and it will just be like a label or a metadata that they are actually selecting in there in that particular organization. So, for example, record last modified. I can choose that particular label if I want to. Now, okay, that's not a record label. Just give me a moment. Do I? Yes, record 7 years. Now, this particular label, when it was created, if you're seeing this particular document, can you see? Okay, let me just get rid of this first. Uh, God. Okay, so here I just wanted to get rid of that particular icon, which was specifying that the required information was missing. Now, if you see this particular document one, there is a lock icon next to it. That indicates that this particular file is a record file. And then if I go to, let's say, delete the file, I will get an error message saying that the label that's applied to this item prevents it from being edited or deleted. Check the items label for more details, right? I cannot delete the document. Let's say if I open the document now, by default, this particular document opens in the reviewing mode. I cannot edit the document because it's now a record, right? So that's the record labels for you. And if I select the document now, and let's say I wanted to create a version out of it, what I will have to do is there I get an additional column called as record status. It's locked for now. I can click on this and unlock the record. The moment I unlock it, right, the lock icon disappears and I'm then able to edit the document if I want to. Right? It opens in the editing mode. I can make the changes. Let's say test content and then close it. Now, what has happened in the background? If I go to versioning, so I have the current unlocked version. I have not logged it yet. But then the previous version, which was a record, is captured automatically by Microsoft. And this is a separate file in itself. It has its own retention period, and that's how the integrity of records is maintained. Even if you use records versioning, I think it's a very good feature. Definitely recommend to make use of this. Yeah. Now, the second thing I wanted to show you is auto apply. We have seen manual apply. I've showed you how you can select a label if you want to. Let's say I'm going to use manual application of labels. In that case, or sorry, automated application of labels. Uh, let's say here I have this particular example. Let's take this particular example, right? The passport number. I have a document called as a passport number is whatever, right? Now, if you see the label is applied by system account. Now this document invoice one, the label applied by is Kunal Kankariya, which is me. That means it was manually applied. But the moment you see label applied by system account, it means this particular label um, this particular label is applied by automatically applied by the system. Now, the way I've configured this label to be applied is when the information type is contract and when the information status is final, go and apply this particular label, right? Record 7 years to any document. I have this configured in the system, and that is why Microsoft applies this particular label. Now, the one thing to note and to understand is that it it does not happen instantly. The label does not automatically get applied instantly. It can take up to 7 days, after which the condition is met, or after you've changed the metadata and the condition is met. It takes anywhere between 7 days, maximum of 7 days, for the label to get applied. Now um, that's a gap, and that's something that you need to explain to the customers when you make sure, because there might be documents or there may be requirements where labels need to be instantly applied. In that case, auto apply is not a good case. Manual application, of course, you have to go for manual application, but most of the times organizations, for most of the retention categories, can live with this option, because auto apply is more beneficial. As I said, you do not have to rely on your users, right? Users, if you ask them to apply a retention label, they will probably never do that. Auto apply, of course, I would recommend that, but you have to make sure that you remember this point, that it takes up to 7 days to apply this particular retention or record label. Quickly moving on to the next one. So we've seen advanced record versionings. The next one is retention policies. Now we have seen retention labels and retention label policies. The next thing to understand is retention policies. Now you've seen you use retention label to and retention labels applies to library level, the folder level, or the document level, which is the item level, of course. Whereas you use a retention policy to assign the same retention settings for at the container level. What do I mean by container? It can either be a site, a team, or a group, or a Microsoft 365 group. Now, you will use retention labels when you want to achieve granularity. For instance, within a document library, you have files that need to have different retention periods. Then you would apply those files with respective retention labels, right? Whereas when you use a retention policy, all the documents in the site, irrespective of which document library they live in, get the same retention period as per the policy. So if you ask me, retention policies are more geared towards enterprise-wide policies, like a default short-term policy, like any information not modified for 3 years needs to be deleted. Let's say that's the design decision my organization has taken, that any document that's not modified for the last 3 years will be deleted automatically unless the users have applied a retention label, right? Those are the kind of policies that you generally those are the kind of requirements where you would generally use retention policies, more of an enterprise wide policies, or to target specific set of sites. I would use retention policies. Now, and when you want to achieve, of course, automation based on certain conditions, then you would use retention labels. As I showed you, the condition can be apply a default label to a document library, right? Only that you can only use retention labels for that, not retention policies. Now, the other differences is that retention policies do not provide users with any visual indicators that an item or document is under retention. Retention labels, as you see, they appear in the column names. You can see the retention labels that are applied. So they have the visual indicators. They also travel with the document or with the content within Microsoft 365. If I move a file with a particular label to a different location, the retention also travels with that particular document, but that's not the case with retention policies. um, your options to start the retention labels from when the content was labeled or based on event, right? Those options are not present in retention policies. Now, again, retention policies do not support disposition review. That means you only have two options: either leave the content, do nothing after the retention period is over, or um, automatically delete that particular document, but not disposition review. You cannot make sure the document is reviewed by someone before it's deleted. Mark the content as a record as a part of the label settings, so that there is a proof of disposition when the content is deleted. That kind of records management cannot be driven through retention policies. Let's have a quick look at retention policies as well. I have 10 minutes. Okay, so information governance, or in fact, let me show you a site where I have retention already in place. Test retention policy. Yes. So this is the site where retention policy is applied. Now, as I said, there is no visual indicator to know that this site is under retention, right? So let's say if I were to, I have a retention setting in this particular on this particular site, and God, slow. So in the compliance center, if you were to create a retention policy, you would go to the information governance tab. It's not available in the records management. Retention policy again is an E3 feature. So you can use that with the E3 license. Let's say I were to delete this particular document, right? So I have uploaded this service proposal here. If I were to delete this particular document, in this case, the document will get deleted. However, since it had a retention setting applied to it, if I go to the preservation hold library, okay, I'm sorry, this particular retention was only for 7 days, and my document was created long back. So let me create a new document. So I have this document one, right? Now I have created this document. Let's say I want to delete this particular document. Now I will be allowed, the end user will be allowed to delete the document. However, if it had a retention in place, it would go to a special library in the same site, which is called a preservation hold library. And you would see that a few seconds ago, we have this document one being moved to the preservation hold library. That means it's retained for compliance reasons. It's retained in this particular preservation hold library. That's how retention policies work. With retention labels, for example, legal advice KK is a retention label. If I were to delete this particular document, I will get an error message, right? So the document is not moved to a preservation hold library, but in case of a retention label or a record label, right, I get an error when I try to delete the document because it's under retention. But in case of retention policies, the whole site is under retention policy. Anything, any changes I make or any deletion that I do will result that file moving to the preservation hold library, right? So that's about retention policies. The next one is the preservation hold library itself. It stores the content that needs to be retained. Now, there are only in these cases the preservation hold library is used. Items in OneDrives that have standard retention labels. So items in OneDrives that have labels, when you delete them, they move to the preservation hold library. Items in SharePoint or OneDrive that have retention labels that mark the item as a record and the item is unlocked for editing. When we saw the lock unlock, what happened was that particular version that you saw previously, which was the previous record, had actually moved also to the preservation hold library. Now, the third one is items that are subject to retention policies. The one that I just showed you, these items are also, these items when deleted also move to the preservation hold library. Now, the last point, I have put two asterisks. If you see, items in SharePoints with retention labels will also start behaving like OneDrive from November. That is from next month onwards. Items in SharePoint, the one that you just saw, right? For example, when I tried to delete that particular document, it gave me an error. That will no longer happen with retention labels. Those items will also move to the preservation hold library. All right. So that's changing next month onwards. So that's your upcoming updates or roadmaps. You have adaptive policy scopes that are coming. I've already been previewing this from February, I think, this year. Since we are design partners with Microsoft, I get access to these features even before the private preview. And adaptive policy scopes allow you to automate scoping of the locations of your label policies and retention policies based on certain criteria. For example, one of the ways we have already started using this is to publish a specific retention label via an adaptive retention label policy to all sites that are of the type project. Now, how would one go about tagging those sites with the metadata? You can use site property bags, index property bags for this particular purpose. So for example, I have 10 sites with the property bag workspace type is project. I can make sure that the policy only applies to only those particular sites. That's just one example. Right. So earlier, what would happen is each time when the site was provisioned, we would have to write a custom scripts to add such sites to the retention label policy using a PowerShell script. Now, all that we don't need to do that anymore. This just works seamlessly. And that's just one example of how you could use adaptive scopes. They can be used at various levels, SharePoint sites, users, even Microsoft 365 groups. So in essence, adaptive scopes allow you to specify target locations dynamically by using certain properties or attributes associated with that scope. So once you've defined your scopes, you can use them in both retention label policies and retention policies. Now that's adaptive policy scopes which are coming. The next thing that's changing, which is coming next month again, is that files with standard retention labels in SharePoint will now appear as deleted for the end users. But for retention purposes, they will move to the preservation hold library, just like how you saw the files that behave when they are under the ambit of a retention policy. They go to the preservation hold library. That behavior will be the same even for files with standard retention labels, but not with record labels, right? Record labels, you will still get that error message called the item cannot be deleted. But with standard retention labels that don't mark the file with records, they will start moving to the preservation hold library when deleted if they are under retention, just like OneDrive. Now, the third update that's coming, and these are just some of the key updates. Currently, if you delete files that have multiple versions, which are again under retention, all the versions move as a separate file to the preservation hold library. This will change and the file will be moved as a single file with all the versions intact. Now, this majorly helps or reduce the load on people who perform things like e-discovery search. Earlier, they used to get hundreds of results because the preservation hold library used to store each version as a separate file. Now the files with the version will be moved as a single file with all the versions intact. All right, so that's changing as well. So Microsoft is constantly working on bringing new features to both the information governance and the information protection space in Microsoft 365. So I think it's an exciting time to be in this particular space. I think that's it from me. To learn more, visit infotection.com. We have several blog posts, hundreds of them, on how to best govern information in Microsoft 365 and protect information in Microsoft 365. I will take questions now. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so
Hi,
there is one
Kunal,
question.
there are questions.
Hi,
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I have answered a couple of them.
I think I interested to know
Mhm.
CAD drawings because a lot of customer also asking when they uses a lot of CAD drawings, yeah, into their how to actually do the labeling
Uh,
sensitive.
are we talking about sensitivity labeling or retention labeling in this case is the question. If we are talking about sensitivity labeling, then what happens in this particular case is um, sensitivity labels can be applied only to Office apps and PDF files right now. So CAD drawings, the label can be applied as a file, but then what would happen is those protection settings will not get enforced on that particular file. So there is no point. So from my perspective, I don't think CAD drawings can come under the ambit of sensitivity
So,
labeling.
any
Yeah.
recommendation meanwhile for this gentleman, Adil?
Uh, you cannot use sensitivity labeling, but then sensitivity labeling is not the only way by which you can protect information, right? The best advice at this point that I can offer is use the access and permissions, right? Make sure your containers. The first step to information protection is not jumping into sensitivity labeling or using DLP, right? First thing is to protect your containers using the default access and permissions that SharePoint gives you, right? Access and permissions at the document library levels. And all that is possible effectively and um, um, at the time of provisioning, right, is when you can take care of all this, because then you have handed over the workspace to the user with all the protection settings enabled. That does not mean I'm not saying do not use sensitivity labels, but start with access and permissions because that's the base thing that you can apply, and then go to sensitivity labels, DLP for advanced information protection. Yeah.
All right. I think some of the questions, maybe let's see. I think that's all, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the compliance and retentions is a very um, to us is a very technical issue, especially when we ask customer to understand and establish a policy, right? Somehow
Mm,
we find very difficult to start to start where you
I
see.
agree.
So
I agree.
any
Yes.
any um any basic
Mm.
pointer for our customer to look into it?
Right. So do not the advice the only advice that I want to give here is that do not look at the compliance aspects of it alone, right? Um, when we talk about retention, when we talk about information protection, sensitivity labeling, we are talking about information governance, and that's where you need to start. Your information governance in Microsoft 365 will only be as solid as your information architecture foundation, right? So start with information architecture. That's the first place that you need to set up. Once you have all those information architecture concepts like your hub site structuring in place, you have these, use all the features that will make sure that people can find the information, people can trust the system first, and then based on that apply retention and records management. Things will become very easy for you, because as you said, Linda, you rightly said, there are a lot of options available. There are a lot of options available. I cannot just go to the compliance center and start configuring retention labels right away, right? You first need a vision. What is the vision related to information management within the organization? You need to establish that first. Establish your critical success factors. What are the critical success factors? Why are you even undertaking this program? Is it because you want to reduce costs, right? Is it because you want the system or better findability of information, better trustworthiness in the system? Is that your end goal? And then the journey to information management, information governance will take shape, because it also often involves about moving legacy content from legacy content management systems, or moving content in legacy content management system to Microsoft 365. So what takes priority? Do I migrate and then establish information governance, or do I establish a good information governance and then migrate? All those questions will be answered. Yeah.
Yep, correct. But to certain industry, they might need a longer retention period. Hence, financial institution and
Mm,
constructions, most of the customer is actually hope to retain all these architecture drawings, yeah, forever. So yes, thank you very much,
You're welcome.
Kunal, for your sharing, and I think we can compile some of your important information sharing in our slide, and then we will send to the audience, yeah, later on. So